The silence was the first thing they noticed. After the deafening, world-ending roar that had shaken the very soil around them, the sudden quiet was a physical presence, a heavy blanket pressing down on the 92 souls huddled in the darkness. At the mouth of the earthen tunnel, 12-year-old Ezra William Dawson blinked against the strange, sickly yellow light that now bathed the world. He was caked in dirt and sweat, a small solitary figure against a landscape that no longer existed. Behind him, men, women and children emerged, their faces pale with shock as they stepped into the splintered remains of their lives. Where houses and barns had stood just minutes before, there was nothing but a wasteland of debris. In the midst of the stunned survivors, Mrs. Beatrice Holloway, a woman who had already buried her own family the year prior, fell to her knees. She didn't cry for her lost home. She wrapped her arms around the small boy, and her sobs of profound gratitude echoed across the flattened plains of Moore, Oklahoma. This is a story about how the deepest trauma can be forged into an incredible act of salvation, and if you are already moved by this powerful moment, I would be honored if you let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people, so please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. I promise you, the journey of how this one forgotten boy achieved the impossible is a testament to the human spirit that is worth hearing until the very end. The story of how this tunnel came to be, and why this boy was the only one who saw the storm coming, is a tale of loss, memory, and the stubborn refusal to be broken by the world. But to understand how the obsessive digging of a traumatized orphan, a project mocked by an entire town as a useless folly, became the sole reason 23 families survived the wrath of an F5 tornado, we must travel back in time. We must go back 13 months, long before Ezra was a savior in anyone's eyes. He was just a boy then, even younger, lost and alone in the aftermath of a different storm. To understand the strength that allowed him to move tons of earth, we must first witness the tragedy that shattered his world and left him with nothing but a promise whispered to the memory of the family he had lost. Our story truly begins in April of 1905, on the day the sky first fell and Ezra Dawson's life was torn from its foundation. The world for 11-year-old Ezra William Dawson had been reduced to three things: the splintered grey of ruined timber, the acrid smell of damp earth and decay, and the impossible, vibrant blue of a scrap of fabric clutched in his hand. For 3 days and 3 nights, he had walked through the skeletal remains of his neighborhood, his voice raw from calling out names that would never be answered. He had navigated a landscape of nightmares, stepping over shattered furniture and the ghosts of familiar landmarks, driven by a child's refusal to accept the silence. He was found on the 3rd day by a rescue party, a small, dirt-streaked figure asleep beside the overturned roots of a massive oak tree. He wasn't crying. His exhaustion was too deep for tears. He was simply holding a piece of his mother's Sunday dress, the last tangible piece of a life that had been stolen by the wind. The men who found him saw a lost boy, but Ezra had already become something else, a survivor, and a keeper of a memory too heavy for his small frame to carry. The days that followed were a blur of impersonal efficiency. He was cleaned, fed, and questioned by solemn-faced adults who wrote his answers in ledgers. The word orphan was spoken in hushed tones around him, a label that felt as foreign and ill-fitting as the donated clothes he now wore. He was no longer Ezra, son of George and Mary, brother to Lily. He was now a line item in the county's records, a problem to be solved, a small tragedy to be filed away. He was transported in the back of a rattling wagon, the journey taking him away from the only land he had ever known. He didn't look back. There was nothing to see but a flat brown wound on the earth where his home used to be. The piece of blue fabric was tucked safely in his pocket, a secret anchor in a world that had come unmoored. Its soft texture, a constant reminder of the warmth he had lost and would spend the rest of his life trying to find again. His new home was 3 kilometers outside the town of Moore, a small, dilapidated farmhouse that seemed to be surrendering to the slow, persistent siege of time and neglect. The paint was peeling in long, sun-bleached strips. The porch sagged with a weary sigh, and the silence here was different. It wasn't the shocked post-disaster quiet of his old life. It was the deep, ingrained silence of abandonment. This was the property of his great-aunt, Mrs. Henrietta Dawson, a woman he had only met twice in his life at church picnics. As he stepped down from the wagon, the dust swirling around his ankles, he felt a profound sense of finality. This was not a refuge, it was an exile. The air was heavy with the scent of dry grass and loneliness, a place where nothing grew with any real enthusiasm, and he felt an immediate kinship with the stubborn, struggling weeds that lined the path to the front door. Mrs. Henrietta Dawson was a woman carved from the same hard, unforgiving earth as her property. At 70 years old, her world had shrunk to the limited radius of her failing senses. Her eyes, clouded with cataracts, saw the world in milky blurs, and she was so deaf that conversation was nearly impossible. She greeted Ezra not with an embrace, but with a squinting, uncertain stare, as if trying to place a piece of furniture that had been unexpectedly delivered. There was no warmth, no comfort, only a curt nod and a gesture toward a small room at the back of the house. He understood with the chilling clarity of a child forced to grow up too soon that he was not family. He was a transaction. He was the $4 monthly stipend from the county, a small sum that ensured his great-aunt would have enough to see her through the winter, and he was the pair of young hands that would now be responsible for the woodpile and the well. His first night in that house was the longest of his life. The room was small and smelled of dust and disuse. A single, lumpy mattress lay on a simple iron frame, and the one window looked out onto a dark, empty field, under a sky overwhelmed with stars that offered no comfort. He lay under a thin, scratchy blanket, listening to the unfamiliar groans of the old house. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind in the eaves was a new and terrifying sound. He pulled the scrap of blue cloth from his pocket, pressing it to his cheek. He closed his eyes and tried to summon his mother's face, his father's voice, his sister's laugh, but the memories were already beginning to feel thin and fragile, like old photographs fading in the sun. The only thing that felt real was the crushing weight of his own solitude, a physical presence in the dark that seemed to suffocate him. His life quickly settled into a rhythm of monotonous, lonely labor. He rose before the sun, the chill of the morning air sharp against his skin, and his first task was always the well. The rope was coarse, digging into his palms as he hauled the heavy wooden bucket up from the dark, cool depths. Then came the woodpile. The axe was too large for him, its weight awkward and dangerous. But he learned to split the logs with determined rhythmic swings. His hands, once soft, became calloused and blistered. These two chores were the pillars of his existence, the price of his shelter. His great-aunt never checked his work, but the consequences of failure were understood. No water meant no cooking, no wood meant a cold hearth. His survival was tied directly to his utility, a harsh lesson he learned with every ache in his young back and every splinter in his fingers. His great-aunt remained a distant, spectral figure in his new life. She moved through the house like a ghost, her days dictated by a routine he could not penetrate. Her deafness created a wall between them that was absolute. He would speak and she would cup her ear, shake her head, and move on. He learned to exist in the margins of her life, a silent worker who kept the essential machinery of her small world functioning. He ate his meals alone at the small kitchen table, simple plates of beans or bread left for him without a word. He was not abused, not in the physical sense, but he was profoundly, completely ignored. This neglect was a different kind of violence, a slow erasure of his own existence. He began to feel as if he were fading, that if he stood still for too long, he might simply disappear into the dusty silence of the house. The trauma of the storm was not a memory, but a living entity inside him. It lived in the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the farmhouse walls. It lived in the sky, which he now watched with a constant, gnawing anxiety. A gathering of dark clouds on the horizon could send a jolt of pure panic through his body, making his heart hammer against his ribs. He learned to read the air, to feel the subtle shifts in pressure, to notice the way the birds flew when the weather was about to turn. The world was no longer a safe place. It was a treacherous, unpredictable force that could rise up at any moment and sweep everything away. He had nightmares every night, vivid replays of the roar of the wind and the sickening sound of his home tearing apart. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his own silent scream trapped in his throat. the phantom smell of rain and ruin filling his small room. In the quiet moments, while stacking wood or staring out at the fields, his mind would drift back, searching for warmth. He remembered his father, George, a man with strong, capable hands and a quiet, patient way of explaining things. He recalled a specific afternoon, sitting on the porch steps, when his father had explained why the stones in the foundation of their barn were laid in a certain way, talking about pressure and load-bearing points and the simple, elegant physics of a well-built arch. His father had been a mason before he was a farmer, and he spoke of stone and structure with a deep, abiding respect. At the time, Ezra had just been a boy listening to his father talk. Now those words were echoes in a vast emptiness, fragments of a lost language he desperately tried to piece back together, a legacy of knowledge he didn't yet know how to use. The sharpest pains were the memories of Lily. She had been 6, a whirlwind of bright laughter and tangled hair. He remembered the small wooden bird his father had carved for her, how she carried it everywhere, making it fly through the air with little whooshing sounds. He found himself searching for it in the wreckage, a foolish, hopeless quest. The guilt was a constant companion, a cold stone in his stomach. He had been in the barn, mending a leather strap for the plough, when the sky had turned that terrifying shade of green. He had survived because of a simple chore. What if he had finished sooner? What if he had been inside the house with them? The questions were a relentless torment, a cycle of self-blame that offered no answers and no peace. He was the one left behind, and he didn't understand why. The scrap of blue fabric became his only confidant. He kept it hidden during the day, tucked away in a loose floorboard beneath his bed. At night he would take it out, its familiar texture a source of grounding comfort in the disorienting sea of his grief. It was more than just cloth. It was the color of his mother's eyes, the memory of her arms around him, the last physical proof that his family had been real. He would whisper to it in the dark, telling his mother about his day, about the blisters on his hands, about the suffocating silence of the house. It was a ritual of remembrance, a desperate act to keep their spirits alive in the one place they could still exist, inside him. This small, torn piece of cotton was his shield against the erasure of his past and the emptiness of his present. Slowly, over the long, hot months of that summer, the raw, paralyzing grief began to change. It didn't lessen, but it began to harden, to transform from a passive ache into something else. It was a cold, hard knot of resolve forming in his gut. The world had shown him its terrifying power, and the adults had shown him their indifference. He understood a fundamental truth. No one was coming to save him. No one would protect him. If he was to survive, he would have to do it himself. The constant fear of the sky, the wind, the clouds, it needed an outlet. The helplessness he felt was a poison, and he knew instinctively that the only antidote was action. He needed to build something, to create a defense against the chaos that had consumed his world. He started watching the low hill at the edge of his great-aunt's property. It was a gentle slope of packed red earth and stubborn prairie grass. Other boys might have seen it as a place to roll down or play games, but Ezra saw it differently. He looked at it with his father's eyes, remembering the lessons about the strength of the earth, about the stability of an arch, about digging into the ground instead of building upon it. The fear that had been haunting him for months began to coalesce into a single, powerful idea. He would not be caught out in the open again. He would not be at the mercy of the wind. He would dig. He would burrow into the earth and build a place that the sky could not touch. The grief was still his companion, but now it had a purpose. It was about to become the fuel for an impossible task. The first shovelful of earth was an act of defiance. The 100th was a prayer. By the 1000th, it had become his entire world. The autumn of 1905 bled into a cold, wind-swept winter, and Ezra's daily ritual remained unbroken. After hauling the water and splitting the wood, he would take the rusty shovel and the heavy pickaxe and walk to the low hill that had become his sanctuary and his obsession. The physical labor was grueling, a constant ache in his shoulders and a fire in his muscles, but it was a clean pain, a manageable pain. It was a pain he could control, unlike the formless, suffocating terror that ambushed him in his sleep. With every swing of the pickaxe, he was chipping away not just at the packed red clay, but at the helplessness that had nearly consumed him. He was no longer just a boy haunted by the past. He was an architect of his own survival, transforming his grief into the tangible geometry of a tunnel. The scent of damp soil became his comfort, and the rhythmic scrape of metal on stone became the new soundtrack of his life. It was inevitable that his strange, solitary project would be discovered. At first it was just whispers among the neighboring farms. A farmer returning from the market would see the small, dirt-caked figure of a boy disappearing into the side of a hill with a wheelbarrow and tell the story at the general store. The whispers soon hardened into a county-wide joke, a piece of local folklore. The phrase, "The Dawson boy is digging to China," became a common refrain, a simple, cruel punchline that erased the complexity of his trauma and replaced it with the absurdity of a child's folly. For Ezra, the laughter was a familiar kind of pain. It was the sound of the world not understanding, the sound of adults dismissing a fear they couldn't see. It reinforced the lesson he had already learned so brutally. He was on his own. The mockery was a wall built of words, isolating him even further inside the silent fortress of his work. The ridicule soon evolved from a distant rumor into a local spectacle. On weekends, families would sometimes make a slow pass by the Dawson property in their wagons, their children pointing toward the growing mound of excavated earth near the hillside. They would stare at him as he emerged from the tunnel entrance, blinking in the sunlight. His face and clothes the same color as the ground he was moving. He felt like an animal in a cage, a curiosity to be observed and then forgotten. The stares were worse than the jokes. They were a constant, passive judgment that made his skin crawl. He learned to ignore them, to retreat deeper into the cool, dark silence of the tunnel, where the world's gaze could not follow. The tunnel was more than a shelter from the sky. It was becoming his refuge from humanity, a place where his purpose was clear and his grief was his own. The unofficial campaign of mockery finally escalated into an official threat in the early spring of 1906. The jokes and the gawking had reached the ears of Mr. Buford Hayes, the town sheriff. One Tuesday afternoon, a cloud of dust on the road announced his arrival. Ezra was hauling a load of fieldstones from the creek bed when the sheriff's black automobile, one of only 3 in the entire county, pulled up to the edge of the property. Sheriff Hayes was a large man, his bulk straining the buttons of his uniform, and he moved with the slow, deliberate certainty of a man who believed his authority was absolute. He didn't approach with curiosity, but with a weary sigh of paternalistic duty. In his eyes, Ezra wasn't a boy trying to build a safe place. He was a problem to be managed, a potential liability that was disrupting the quiet order of his jurisdiction. The sheriff walked over to the entrance of the tunnel, peering into the darkness with a skeptical frown. He kicked at the pile of discarded clay with the toe of his polished boot, as if testing the legitimacy of the entire endeavor. He turned to Ezra, his voice not unkind, but firm and dismissive, the tone an adult uses when correcting a child's nonsensical game. He spoke of safety concerns, of the unstable nature of the soil, of the risks of a cave-in. He used words like reckless and irresponsible. Every word was a dismissal of the memory that drove Ezra, a complete failure to comprehend the terror of the wind's roar. The sheriff saw a dangerous hole in the ground. Ezra saw the only thing that made him feel like he could breathe again. The conversation was a dialogue between 2 different worlds, one governed by rules and regulations, the other by the visceral memory of absolute destruction. Then the threat became explicit, a clear and unavoidable barrier placed directly in his path. The sheriff crossed his arms, his expression hardening. He stated that as the legal authority in the county, he could not permit a child to engage in such a hazardous activity on his own. He declared the tunnel an unstable pit and a public nuisance. He informed Ezra that he was ordering him to cease all digging immediately. He said he would be back in 1 week to ensure the work had stopped, and if it hadn't, he would have no choice but to bring in men to fill the hole in and to speak with the county administrators about Ezra's living situation. The words hung in the air, a devastating blow. The sheriff wasn't just threatening to end his project, he was threatening to take away the one thing that gave his life meaning and to potentially remove him from the only home he had left. A cold, sharp panic seized Ezra's chest, so intense it felt like the moment the sky had turned green all over again. For a terrifying second, he felt 11 years old and completely helpless. But then something else rose up to meet the fear, a stubborn, unyielding wave of defiance. He looked at the sheriff, at this man who knew nothing of his loss, and he felt a profound, clarifying anger. How could he explain? How could he put into words the sound of his house splintering apart, or the weight of the silence that followed? He couldn't. The reasons for his digging were a language the sheriff couldn't speak. In that moment, Ezra understood that the world of adults, with its rules and its condescending logic, was as dangerous a force as any storm. It sought to manage his grief, to tidy it away, to fill it in with dirt because it was an inconvenience. Just as the sheriff was about to deliver a final, authoritative warning, the screen door of the farmhouse creaked open. Mrs. Henrietta Dawson shuffled out onto the sagging porch, squinting into the afternoon sun. She was a frail silhouette against the bright light, her movements slow and uncertain. In her deafness and her near-blindness, she was a figure from another time, completely detached from the official confrontation unfolding on her property. To the sheriff, she was a negligent old woman who was allowing her great-nephew to endanger himself. To Ezra, she was the embodiment of the isolation he had endured for a year. He held his breath, expecting her to somehow make things worse, to surrender to the sheriff's authority without understanding what was at stake. He had never felt more alone than in that moment, caught between the law of man and the indifference of his guardian. Sheriff Hayes, visibly annoyed by the interruption, turned his attention to the old woman. He raised his voice, shouting his concerns across the yard, explaining the danger and his official order to stop the digging. Mrs. Dawson simply stood there, one hand cupped to her ear in a gesture of futility. She stared blankly in his direction, her clouded eyes revealing no flicker of comprehension. The sheriff tried again, speaking slower and louder, his face turning red with the effort. He pointed emphatically at the tunnel, then at Ezra, then back at the tunnel, his elaborate gestures a desperate attempt to breach the wall of her silence. The scene was almost comical. The most powerful man in the county, rendered completely impotent, his authority dissolving into meaningless noise against the unbreachable fortress of an old woman's failing senses. After a full minute of the sheriff's fruitless shouting, Mrs. Henrietta Dawson seemed to come to a decision. It was not a decision based on his arguments, which she hadn't heard, but likely on a simple assessment that this loud man was a disruption to her quiet afternoon. She gave a small, dismissive shake of her head, turned around without a word, and shuffled back into the house. The screen door slammed shut behind her, the sound sharp and final in the quiet air. It was not an act of defiance on her part, it was an act of complete and utter apathy. She harbored a long-standing, unspoken dislike for all forms of officious authority, and the sheriff was simply the latest example. Her neglect, which had been a source of Ezra's deep loneliness, had suddenly and unintentionally become his greatest protection. The sheriff stood in the yard for a long moment, his mouth slightly agape, utterly defeated. There was nothing more he could do. He couldn't reason with a woman who couldn't hear him, and he couldn't legally force his way into her home. He shot Ezra one last look, a mixture of frustration and warning, a silent promise that this was not over. Then he turned, walked back to his automobile and drove away, leaving behind another cloud of dust and an unresolved threat. Ezra was left standing by the creek bed, his heart still pounding. The immediate danger had passed, but the sheriff's words echoed in his mind. 1 week. He now had a deadline. The town's ridicule had finally grown teeth, and it had a name. Buford Hayes. The race was on. He had to finish his shelter, his sanctuary, before the world found a way to take it from him for good. The sheriff's dust settled slowly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. For a long time Ezra did not move. He stood by the creek bed, the weight of the man's words pressing down on him, a familiar, suffocating force. 1 week, 168 hours. The number tolled in his mind like a funeral bell. The world, which had already taken everything from him once, was now threatening to take the only thing he had built to defy it. The tunnel was more than just earth and stone. It was the physical manifestation of his grief, his fear, and his stubborn will to survive. To have it filled in, to have it erased by the casual authority of a man who saw only a dangerous pit, felt like a second annihilation. It was the threat of being buried all over again. Not by dirt, but by the world's indifference. A cold, familiar dread washed over him, the same paralyzing helplessness he'd felt waking up in the wreckage of his old life. He felt small, powerless, and utterly, terrifyingly alone. But as the sun dipped lower, casting long, lonely shadows across the field, the despair began to curdle into something harder. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the worn, soft square of blue fabric. He pulled it out, its vibrant color a stark contrast to the drab landscape. It was the color of defiance. It was the memory of his mother's strength, the echo of his father's steady hands. He would not let them be buried again. The sheriff, with his polished boots and his easy confidence, knew nothing of the roar. He had never smelled the ozone in the air just before the world ended. He had never had to listen for voices in a silence that screamed. In that moment, a profound and simple clarity washed through Ezra. This was not a negotiation. It was a war. A silent, solitary war against the sky, against memory, and now against the well-meaning ignorance of men. He would not stop. He would finish. He would work until his hands bled and his back broke, because the alternative was a surrender he could not bear to make. The decision, once made, settled in his chest, not as a burden, but as a cold, clear purpose. He walked back to the tunnel, his steps now firm and deliberate. He lit a single lantern, its flickering flame pushing back the encroaching darkness, and he took inventory of the monumental task ahead. The main corridor was stable, but the central chamber, the heart of his sanctuary, was still vulnerable. The walls needed more reinforcement, and the arched ceiling, the most critical piece of his father's design, was nothing more than a dangerous cavern of exposed earth. He had to build the wooden support structure, haul and shape the flat capstones, and then, most perilously, set the keystone that would lock it all into place. He saw the work not as days, but as hours, as minutes. He saw the wheelbarrow loads of stone, the swings of the pickaxe, the careful placement of each rock, a frantic and desperate arithmetic of survival against a ticking clock. The sheer volume of labor required seemed impossible, a task for a team of men, not one 12-year-old boy. But the word impossible had lost its meaning a year ago. His life immediately contracted into a singular, grueling focus. The days of working in the afternoon sun were over. His labor began in the cold pre-dawn grey, the damp air clinging to his skin as he used the faint light to pry stones from the creek bed. He learned to move with a quiet efficiency, his senses on high alert, his ears tuned for the sound of an approaching engine on the distant road. He worked through the day, taking only brief pauses to eat the food his great-aunt left for him, which he now devoured with a ravenous hunger born of pure physical depletion. When dusk fell, he did not stop. He would light his lantern and descend back into the earth, his shadow dancing on the clay walls as he worked late into the night. He was a ghost, a creature of the twilight and the dark, his world shrinking to the narrow beam of his lantern and the cool, solid feel of the stones that were his only allies in this race against time. The fear was a constant, metallic taste in the back of his throat. He was no longer just afraid of the sky. He was now terrified of the sound of the world intruding upon his work. Every snap of a twig in the woods, every distant bark of a dog sent a jolt of adrenaline through him, making him freeze in the darkness of the tunnel, his heart hammering against his ribs. He imagined the sheriff returning early, finding him deep within the earth. He envisioned the look of stern disapproval on the man's face, the finality in his voice as he ordered the work to cease forever. This new fear was more immediate than the memory of the storm. It was a living threat that walked on two legs and drove an automobile. He had to fight it down every hour, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand, channeling the panic into the rhythmic swing of the axe, turning his terror into fuel for his desperate, frantic labor. In the deepest hours of the night, when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, he would close his eyes and summon his father's voice. He remembered one specific lesson, delivered on a hot summer afternoon as they repaired a stone wall on the old farm. His father had picked up a wedge-shaped stone, turning it over in his calloused hands. He had explained the principle of the keystone, how this one single stone, placed last at the apex of an arch, bore all the pressure. He said it didn't just hold the weight, it transformed the downward force, pushing it outward along the curve of the arch and into the solid earth. Kurt turned a crushing burden into an unbreakable strength. That memory became his scripture. The sheriff saw a pile of rocks. Ezra saw a miracle of physics, a secret passed from a father to a son. He was not just digging a hole, he was building an arch against the weight of the world. One evening, covered in a fresh layer of red dust and grime, he paused at the entrance to the tunnel and looked back toward the dark, silent farmhouse. A single lamp glowed weakly in one window, the room where his great-aunt would be sitting, lost in her own world of silence and shadows. He felt a sudden, unexpected pang of connection to the place. It had never been a home, not in the way he remembered, but it had been a shelter. It was the place that had allowed him the solitude to begin his healing, to transform his pain into purpose. He knew with a chilling certainty that if the sheriff filled in his tunnel, he would also recommend that Ezra be removed from the property, sent to a county home, a place of sterile efficiency and true anonymity. This desperate final push was not just to save his project. It was to save this last fragile piece of his independence. It was a silent, desperate farewell to the quiet, lonely life he had carved out for himself here. His body began to fail him in small, agonizing ways. The blisters on his hands had long since given way to thick calluses, but now those calluses were cracking, splitting open in the cold night air. His back was a solid, unrelenting wall of pain, and his shoulders burned with a fire that never went out. He grew thinner, the already meager flesh on his bones seeming to melt away, consumed by the ceaseless work. His face became gaunt, his eyes sinking deeper into their sockets, but they held a feverish, unwavering light. He was burning himself down to build his fortress, pouring every ounce of his young life, his energy, his very substance into the cold, unforgiving earth. He moved like an old man, his joints groaning in protest, but he worked with the singular, manic energy of someone who knew that stopping meant the end of everything. He was becoming part of the landscape, his skin the color of the clay, his spirit as hard and unyielding as the stones he carried. On the fourth day, something shifted. When he came in from his pre-dawn labor, he found an extra biscuit and a small piece of salted pork waiting for him on the kitchen table, alongside his usual meager breakfast. He stopped, staring at the offering. His great-aunt sat in her chair by the cold hearth, her back to him. She had not turned, had not spoken, but she had seen. In her own blurry, silent way, she had registered his exhaustion, the deepening shadows under his eyes, the way he now moved as if every step was an effort. She could not hear his fears or understand his motivations, but she understood the universal language of a body being pushed past its limits. It was not an act of love, perhaps not even of kindness, but it was an acknowledgement. It was a silent, profound statement that he was not entirely invisible. That small portion of food was the most profound encouragement he had received in over a year, a tiny spark of humanity in the vast, lonely darkness of his task. The point of no return arrived on the evening of the sixth day. He had finished reinforcing the walls of the central chamber and had, with painstaking effort, built the curved wooden scaffold that would temporarily support the arched ceiling. Now came the most dangerous part. He began to lay the heavy, flat fieldstones across the top of the frame, one by one, working by the unsteady light of his lantern. The air in the chamber was thick with the smell of damp earth and his own sweat. Each stone he lifted felt impossibly heavy, and placing it on the frame required a steadiness his exhausted body barely possessed. He knew that a single mistake, a single stone slipping from his grasp, could trigger a catastrophic collapse, burying him alive under tons of rock and clay. This was the final test of his father's knowledge and his own resolve. He was no longer just building a shelter. He was deep inside the earth, holding up the roof of his world, with nothing but his own 2 hands and a memory. The final 24 hours were a blur of continuous, agonizing motion. Sleep was a luxury he could not afford. The ticking clock in his mind had become a deafening roar, louder than the memory of the tornado. The world outside the tunnel ceased to exist. There was only the next stone, the next shovel of dirt, the next aching breath. He moved in a trance of pure adrenaline and exhaustion, his thoughts narrowing to a single burning point: the keystone. He had saved the perfect wedge-shaped rock, the one his father's voice had described in his memory. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky on the 7th day, the day the sheriff was due to return, he hoisted the final stone into place. With a soft grating sound, it slid into the gap at the apex of the arch. For a moment everything was still. Then, with a collective groan, the arch settled, the immense weight distributing itself, transforming from a burden into an unbreakable, unified strength. He had done it. The tunnel was complete. He felt it before he saw it, a change in the very texture of the air. The afternoon heat, which had been a dry, baking presence all day, suddenly became thick, heavy, and unnervingly still. A profound silence fell over the plains, a quiet so deep it felt like the world holding its breath. Ezra looked up from the woodpile, his axe forgotten in his hand. The sky to the west was no longer blue. It was a nauseating shade of green, a sickly, jaundiced color he remembered, with a clarity that stole the air from his lungs. His father's words echoed in his mind, a ghostly lecture from a life ago. When the sky turns that color, and the birds stop singing, you don't walk, you run. The birds had stopped singing. There was no debate, no moment of hesitation. The memory that had been his tormentor for 13 months now became his command. The time for digging was over. The time for running had just begun. He dropped the axe, its clang against a nearby stone unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet, and began to run, not toward his shelter, but away from it. His first destination was the Henderson farm, the closest property to the east. His bare feet pounded against the dry, cracked earth of the path, kicking up small puffs of red dust with every stride. The air was so dense it felt like running through water, each breath a conscious effort. He could feel the pressure in his ears, a strange, internal humming that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. He focused on the rhythm of his own ragged breathing, the frantic beat of his heart against his ribs, trying to outrun the images flashing in his mind. The splintered wood, the impossible silence, the scrap of blue fabric. He had to warn them. He had to make them understand what that color in the sky meant. It wasn't just a storm. It was a monster, a living thing that ate houses and swallowed lives, and he could feel it waking up on the horizon. He vaulted a low stone wall, his muscles screaming in protest, his mind fixed on the distant shape of the Hendersons' barn. He burst into their yard like a wild animal, his chest heaving, his voice a raw, breathless croak. He found Mr. Henderson calmly mending a fence post, a hammer in his hand. The words tumbled out of Ezra, a frantic, disorganized plea about the sky, the silence, the tunnel. He pointed westward, his hand shaking, begging the man to look, to see the danger. Mr. Henderson paused his work, a slow, condescending smile spreading across his face. He was one of the men who had most enjoyed the joke about Ezra digging to China. He squinted at the sky, then chuckled, a low, dismissive sound that cut Ezra deeper than any insult. He told the boy to calm down, that it was just a spring squall coming, nothing to get worked up about. He patted Ezra on the head, a gesture of paternalistic dismissal, and told him to run along home before he got caught in the rain. The finality in the man's tone, the complete, unshakable certainty of his ignorance, felt like a physical blow. For a single agonizing moment, Ezra faltered. The laughter he had endured for months, the whispers, the pointing fingers, it all came rushing back, personified in Mr. Henderson's smug, knowing smile. He stood frozen in the farmyard, the man's dismissive words echoing in his ears. Was he wrong? Was this all in his head, a phantom of his trauma projected onto a simple change in the weather? The urge to turn back, to retreat to the solitary safety of his tunnel and let the world face its own fate, was immense. It was a powerful temptation to surrender to the loneliness they had all forced upon him. But then a gust of wind, unnaturally cold, snaked across the yard, carrying the scent of ozone and damp earth. He looked back at the sky. The green was deeper now, angrier. He thought of his sister, Lily. He thought of the weight of the silence after the roar. The doubt evaporated, burned away by a certainty forged in unimaginable loss. He was not wrong. He didn't waste another breath on the Hendersons. He turned and ran, his direction now altered by a desperate calculation. He would go to the Holloway farm. It was further, a longer, more draining run across an open pasture, but he remembered overhearing the women at the general store. He knew Mrs. Beatrice Holloway had lost her husband and eldest son in the storm the year before. She was one of the few people in the entire county who might speak the same language of fear that he did. She would understand the terror that lived in a green sky. The decision gave his flagging energy a new focus. He ran with a renewed purpose, his small figure a lonely, determined speck moving across the vast, empty landscape beneath a sky that was growing more menacing with every passing second. His fragile determination was now a shield against the world's disbelief, a thin but resilient armor protecting the desperate hope in his heart. The physical reality of his desperate mission began to take its toll. The run across the open field was brutal. His lungs were on fire, each gasp for air a searing pain in his chest. A sharp stitch had developed in his side, a stabbing agony that made him want to double over. The wind was no longer a whisper. It was a steady, insistent force pushing against him, whipping his hair into his eyes and filling the air with a low, mournful moan. It carried with it the first fat drops of rain, which splattered against his dusty skin. Not refreshing, but cold and oily. He stumbled over an unseen rock, his knee scraping raw against the unforgiving ground. He pushed himself back up, his legs screaming in protest, his body begging him to stop. But he couldn't. He could see the small Holloway farmhouse now, a distant beacon of hope, and he forced his aching legs to keep moving, one agonizing step after another. He found her exactly as he'd hoped, and feared. Beatrice Holloway was standing on her porch, her two young children huddled against her legs, all three of them staring at the western sky with wide, terrified eyes. She saw him coming, a dirt-streaked boy, running with a desperate, wounded gait. When he finally reached her steps, he was too exhausted to speak, only able to gasp for air and point back the way he had come. But he didn't need words. She saw the truth in his eyes. It was the same haunted, knowing look she saw in her own reflection every morning. It was the look of someone who knew what the wind could do. When he finally found his voice and whispered the single word, tunnel, she didn't hesitate. She didn't ask questions. She simply gathered her children, her face a pale mask of grim resolve, and nodded. That silent, immediate understanding was the first true human connection Ezra had felt in 13 months. Watching her grab her children's hands and begin running toward the distant hill where his tunnel lay was like a cool drink of water in a desert. A wave of profound, shuddering relief washed over him, so intense it almost buckled his knees. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't alone in his fear. Someone believed him. That single act of faith from a woman who shared his trauma gave him the strength to continue. Her trust was a shield, a validation of the long months of lonely labor and relentless mockery. He watched them for a moment longer, a small family running for their lives, their trust placed entirely in the hands of a 12-year-old boy and his impossible hole in the ground. Then he turned, his own pain and exhaustion momentarily forgotten, and ran toward the next farm, his voice now finding a new strength, a new authority born from that first crucial victory. His desperate journey became a frantic, sprawling marathon against time. He was a modern-day Paul Revere. His warning carried not on horseback, but on the thin, straining legs of a traumatized boy. At the Miller farm, they slammed the door in his face. At the Petersons, the older boys threw a clod of dirt at him and laughed. But at the Connolly house, where a new baby had been born just 3 weeks prior, Mrs. Connolly took one look at the sky, one look at Ezra's desperate face, and began screaming for her husband to get the children. He found believers in the margins, the families who had lost livestock in the last storm, the elderly couple who had lived through the great tornado of '89, the people for whom the sky was not a distant abstraction, but a known and respected enemy. A pattern emerged. Those who had already lost something were the quickest to listen. The world around him was transforming, the landscape itself becoming an active threat. The unsettling silence had been replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It was a sound he felt in his teeth, a vibration that promised imminent violence. The sky was no longer just green. It was a churning, bruised canvas of dark, angry clouds that seemed to be boiling from within. The wind now came in powerful, unpredictable gusts, strong enough to tear leaves from the trees and send them spiraling through the air like frantic birds. And then he saw it. Far to the southwest, a dark, menacing tail began to descend from the belly of the clouds. A thin, ethereal wisp of vapor that was slowly, inexorably, thickening and reaching for the ground. The monster was showing its face. He stopped dead in the middle of a vast, empty cornfield. The sight of the funnel cloud, even from this distance, was a physical blow. It was as if a hand had reached out of the sky and clamped around his heart, squeezing the air from his lungs. The memory of the roar, not as a distant echo but as a present, a visceral sensation filled his head. He could smell the rain and the splintered pine, feel the ground shaking beneath his feet. For a terrifying, eternal second, he was 11 years old again, paralyzed by a force so immense and absolute that his own existence felt like a fragile mistake. His legs refused to move, his throat closed up. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the approaching doom threatened to swallow his fragile resolve completely, leaving him to be swept away just like everyone else. But then, through the paralyzing terror, another image broke through. It was the memory of his father's hands, dusty with stone and calloused from work, patiently turning a wedge-shaped rock over and over, explaining the simple, beautiful logic of the keystone. He remembered his father's quiet confidence, his belief in the power of a well-built structure. He thought of his mother's smile, the blue of her dress. This tunnel, this desperate, impossible project, was not just a monument to his fear. It was a monument to their memory, the only one he could build. He was the keeper of his father's knowledge, the last living vessel of his family's story. Surrendering now would be the final erasure. The thought broke the spell. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in his stomach, but his purpose was now larger than his terror. He took a ragged breath and forced his legs to move, his own shout cutting through the rising wind. His run became a final, desperate sprint. He was no longer a boy begging. He was a commander pointing to the undeniable truth descending from the sky. There was no more laughter, no more skepticism. Faces that had been smug with disbelief were now pale with terror. The trickle of believers had become a river of panicked humanity. He saw Mr. Henderson, his face ashen, carrying his youngest daughter, screaming for his wife to run faster. He saw families pouring out of their homes, a disorganized, terrified exodus all heading in one direction, toward the low hill on the Dawson property. He had become the unwilling center of their universe, the single point of hope in a world that was about to come undone. He ran alongside them, his raw voice urging them on, pointing the way to the sanctuary he had carved out of his own grief. He was the last to reach the tunnel's entrance, standing aside like a shepherd as his frightened flock scrambled into the dark earthen mouth. He counted them as they passed, their faces a blur of fear and desperation. 90, 91. The air outside was now electric, charged with a palpable energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. The distant rumble had grown into a deafening, continuous roar, like a freight train that was miles wide and bearing down directly on them. He stood his ground until the last person, Mrs. Holloway with her arms wrapped tightly around her children, was safely inside. He took one final look at the world he was leaving behind. The funnel cloud was a monstrous, churning vortex now, obscuring the sky, its roar a physical presence that vibrated through the very soil beneath his feet. He turned and plunged into the darkness, pulling the heavy, reinforced wooden door shut, just as the universe began to scream. Inside the tunnel, the world was reduced to the primal sensations of darkness, pressure, and sound. The heavy wooden door slammed shut with a solid, final thud, cutting off the sickly green light and plunging 92 souls into an almost absolute blackness. The air was instantly thick with the scent of damp earth, sweat, and the electric, ozone-tinged smell of the storm itself. The roar was no longer a distant threat. It was a physical entity, a monstrous, all-consuming presence that pressed in from all sides. It was a sound that didn't just enter the ears, but vibrated through the soles of their feet, through the packed dirt walls, and into the very marrow of their bones. They were packed together, a terrified mass of humanity huddled in the belly of the earth, their individual fears merging into one collective wave of silent, desperate prayer. Ezra was pressed against the cool, rough wall. The texture of the fieldstones he had set himself a small, grounding reality, in the overwhelming chaos. A single lantern held by one of the farmers cast a weak, flickering yellow light that did little to push back the oppressive dark. It threw long, dancing shadows against the arched ceiling, making the faces of the people around him into distorted masks of terror. Children were crying, their small whimpers swallowed by the deafening symphony of destruction outside. The ground beneath them was no longer stable. It shook with a violent, rhythmic intensity, a constant, brutal tremor that felt as if a giant were trying to shake their sanctuary apart. Dust and small pebbles rained down from the ceiling, pattering on their heads and shoulders, each small impact a fresh jolt of fear. Ezra watched the keystone, the single wedge-shaped rock at the apex of the arch, barely visible in the gloom. He held his breath, seeing not a stone, but his father's hands, his father's voice, his father's entire legacy being put to the ultimate, terrifying test against the full fury of the sky. His mind went quiet, his focus narrowing to the structure itself. He was no longer a boy, no longer an orphan. He was an engineer listening to the language of stress and pressure. He could feel the immense crushing weight of the storm directly above them, a force of nature that could splinter oak trees and toss wagons like toys. He felt the downward pressure on the arch and, in his mind's eye, he saw it being transformed, pushed outward along the curve of the stones and down into the solid, unyielding earth on either side. Every groan of the structure was a word, every shower of dust a sentence. He was locked in a silent dialogue with his creation, his hands flat against the wall trying to feel its integrity, to sense any sign of weakness or failure. The terror he felt was cold and sharp, but it was overshadowed by a profound, desperate concentration. Everything, his loss, his pain, his work, had led to this single, defining moment of truth deep beneath the screaming earth. The roar intensified, rising in pitch and volume until it became a physical agony, a high-frequency shriek that seemed to vibrate the very air out of their lungs. The shaking became so violent that people lost their footing, stumbling against one another in the dark. This was it, the heart of the monster passing directly overhead. In that moment of absolute, world-ending violence, Ezra was certain they were going to die. He was sure the arch would fail, that the tons of earth above them would collapse and entomb them all in a grave of his own making. The mockery of the townspeople, the sheriff's warning, it all came rushing back as a chorus of failure. He squeezed his eyes shut, his knuckles white as he clutched the scrap of blue fabric in his pocket. He braced himself for the sickening sound of splintering rock and the final crushing darkness, a silent apology to his mother on his lips. And then it began to change. It was not a sudden cessation, but a gradual, almost imperceptible shift in the quality of the sound. The high-pitched scream began to recede, replaced by the lower, rumbling roar of a colossal freight train moving away into the distance. The violent, bone-jarring shaking lessened, subsiding into a steady tremor, then a faint vibration, and then, finally, an impossible, profound stillness. The ground beneath their feet was solid again. The only sound was the frantic, ragged breathing of 92 people who had just stared into the abyss and survived. The transition from absolute chaos to absolute quiet was so abrupt, so complete, that it felt like its own form of violence, a silence so deep and heavy it was a physical weight pressing down on them all. For a long, stunned moment, no one moved, no one spoke. They were simply there together in the dark, breathing. The silence held for what felt like an eternity, a shared, sacred space of disbelief. It was a quiet he knew intimately, the quiet that comes after the world has been torn apart. But this time it was different. In 1905, the silence had been the sound of loss, of being left behind. This silence was the sound of survival. It was the sound of the keystone holding. It was the sound of his father's knowledge being proven true. A baby, too young to understand what had happened, let out a startled cry, and the sound, so normal and full of life, shattered the spell. A man near the front let out a long, shuddering sob of pure relief. A woman began to pray aloud, her voice thick with tears of gratitude. The collective tension that had held them all rigid in the darkness began to break, replaced by a wave of exhausted, disbelieving, and overwhelming relief. Ezra sagged against the wall, his legs suddenly too weak to support him. The strength that had carried him through the last 13 months, through the digging, the mockery, and the desperate race to warn his neighbors, drained out of him all at once. He slid down the rough stone wall until he was sitting on the cool, damp floor, the adrenaline leaving him feeling hollowed out and shaky. He had done it. The tunnel had held. They were alive. He looked through the gloom at the huddled shapes of the survivors, at the families holding each other, at the children being comforted by their parents. For the first time since he had lost his own family, he was not alone in the aftermath of the storm. He was surrounded by the very lives his grief had saved, a silent, powerful testament to the love he had refused to let the world erase. They remained in the comforting darkness for another 20 minutes, though it felt like a lifetime. No one was eager to face the world outside. The tunnel had become a sanctuary, a womb of cool earth that had protected them from annihilation. But eventually, the need to know, the need to see what remained, became stronger than the fear. A quiet discussion rippled through the survivors, and all eyes eventually turned to the small, dirt-caked boy sitting by the wall. He was the one who had built this place. He was the one who should lead them out. Ezra looked up, seeing their faces turned toward him, their expressions no longer filled with ridicule or skepticism, but with a profound, humbling awe. He found Mrs. Holloway's gaze in the faint lantern light. She gave him a small, trembling nod of encouragement, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He took a deep, steadying breath and slowly, deliberately got to his feet. He walked the length of the corridor toward the main entrance, his steps feeling unnaturally loud in the now quiet tunnel. The air near the door was cool and smelled of wet earth and splintered wood. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, not with fear, but with the sheer, unadulterated exhaustion of body and soul. He placed his palm flat against the heavy, reinforced planks. For a moment he simply stood there, feeling the solid wood beneath his hand, the final barrier between the life they had known and whatever new, broken world awaited them. He thought of his parents and his sister, wishing they could be here, wishing he could show them that he had remembered, that he had listened. He closed his eyes, whispered their names into the darkness one last time, and then put his shoulder to the door and began to push. The door resisted at first, scraping against what felt like a heavy layer of mud and debris. Several of the men joined him, adding their strength to his. With a collective groan of effort and a grating, screeching sound of wood against earth, the door gave way, swinging inward just enough to open a narrow vertical slit. A beam of strange, otherworldly light, a sickly, jaundiced yellow, sliced through the darkness, illuminating the thick clouds of dust still hanging in the air. It was the light of a world remade. Ezra stepped forward, alone, drawn toward that sliver of impossible color. He squeezed through the opening and stood at the mouth of his earthen tunnel, blinking against the strange new sun as he took his first look at the flattened, unrecognizable plains of Moore, Oklahoma. The silence was the first thing he noticed. The world outside the tunnel was a silent alien planet. The air, thick with the smell of wet soil and pulverized wood, was cast in a sickly yellow-orange light that seemed to emanate from the bruised clouds themselves. As the survivors emerged one by one, their faces were blank masks of shock, their movements slow and dreamlike. They stepped out of the dark earthen womb into a landscape of total annihilation. Where homes and barns and century-old trees had stood just minutes before, there was now only a flat, brown wound on the earth, littered with the unrecognizable splinters of their former lives. The scale of the destruction was so absolute that it defied comprehension, silencing the cries and prayers that had filled the tunnel just moments ago. There was only a collective, indrawn breath, a shared moment of horrified understanding. They had survived, but their world had not. In the midst of this profound post-apocalyptic quiet, every eye in the crowd of 91 survivors eventually turned from the wreckage around them to the simple, unadorned mouth of the tunnel from which they had just emerged. It was the only structure, the only piece of geometry in a world that had been rendered shapeless, and then their gaze shifted, as if pulled by an invisible string, to the small solitary figure of the boy who stood beside it. Ezra was caked in mud and dust, his clothes torn, his face gaunt with exhaustion. He was just a child, a strange, quiet boy they had all whispered about, the boy who spent his days digging a useless hole. He was the reason they were breathing, the reason their children were still clinging to their legs. The thought settled not with a sudden crash, but with a slow dawning and overwhelming weight. The mockery that had been a constant low hum in Ezra's life for 13 months died in that moment. It did not fade. It was obliterated, scoured from existence as completely as the houses that now lay in ruins. He could see the change happen in real time. A wave of realization passing across the faces of his neighbors. He saw it in the eyes of Mr. Henderson, the farmer who had laughed at him just an hour before. The man's face was no longer smug or dismissive. It was a canvas of shame, awe, and a gratitude so profound it seemed to physically pain him. He saw it in the faces of the Peterson boys, who had thrown dirt at him, now huddled behind their father, looking at Ezra as if he were a figure from a legend. The entire social fabric of their community was being rewoven in that terrible, beautiful silence, with a 12-year-old orphan at its absolute center. A low murmur started to ripple through the crowd, a sound of pure, unadulterated reverence. The words were simple, whispered from person to person. He knew. The boy knew. The tunnel held. Each phrase was an admission of their own folly and a testament to his impossible foresight. They looked at the arched entrance, at the carefully placed fieldstones, and they no longer saw a child's strange game. They saw an engineering marvel. They saw the work not of a disturbed mind, but of a brilliant and determined one. The physical proof of his conviction was all around them, in the very fact that they were standing there to witness it. The laughter and the jokes about digging to China had been turned to ash, and from that ash rose a new and undeniable truth. This forgotten boy had been their prophet, and his obsession had been their salvation. Then a single figure detached from the stunned crowd. It was Mrs. Beatrice Holloway. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a grief he recognized, for she too had lost a family to the wind. She moved with a strange, deliberate grace through the debris, her gaze locked on Ezra. She was not just a survivor. She was a witness, a living link between the tragedy of the past and the miracle of the present. The entire community fell silent, watching her. They understood that she, more than anyone, had the right to speak. She had felt the unique agony of being left behind by a storm, and by following Ezra, she had been spared from having that wound torn open a second time. Her slow, determined walk toward him was a pilgrimage, a journey of a few meters that carried the emotional weight of a lifetime. She did not stop until she was standing directly in front of him, so close he could see the tear tracks cutting paths through the dust on her cheeks. She looked down at the small, exhausted boy, and her expression was not one of pity, but of a deep, soul-shaking reverence. She didn't say a word at first. Instead, she slowly sank to her knees in the mud and splintered wood, bringing herself down to his level. It was an act of such profound humility that it sent a shockwave through the onlookers. She was not a woman comforting a child. She was a supplicant before a savior. She reached out, her hands trembling, and wrapped her arms around his thin, dirt-caked frame, pulling him into an embrace that was fierce with gratitude and thick with the shared understanding of their grief. The hug was not gentle. It was a desperate, anchoring act, the gesture of someone who had been adrift and had finally found solid ground. And then she spoke, her voice breaking but loud enough for all to hear, a public declaration that would forever define Ezra's life. "You saved us," she sobbed, her words muffled against his shoulder. "Oh, you dear, brave boy, you saved all of us." The words were a key, unlocking something deep inside Ezra that had been frozen for 13 agonizing months. It was more than just praise. It was validation. It was the world finally acknowledging the depth of his pain, the righteousness of his fear, and the profound love that had fueled his impossible labor. The weight of his father's memory, which had been a crushing burden of responsibility, was suddenly transformed into a shield that had protected them all. He felt a tremor run through his own body, a deep, shuddering release that started in his chest and worked its way outward. The loneliness that had been his constant companion, the suffocating silence of his great-aunt's house, the sting of every whispered joke, it all began to dissolve in the warmth of that embrace. He was not the strange Dawson boy anymore. He was not an object of pity or scorn. In the eyes of this woman, in the eyes of his entire community, he was seen. He was understood. The wall he had built around his heart, a structure far more formidable than the tunnel itself, began to crumble. He had spent a year moving the earth to build a shelter from the sky, but it was the simple human touch of this grieving woman that finally gave him a shelter for his soul. The tears that came were not the hot, angry tears of a traumatized child. They were quiet, cleansing tears of a profound, soul-deep relief. He wept for the family he had lost, but for the first time he wept without the crushing guilt of being the one who survived. He wept for the father whose knowledge, passed down on a quiet afternoon, had become a life-saving legacy. He wept for the long nights of agonizing labor, for the blisters on his hands and the ache in his back, all of it now redeemed, every painful moment imbued with a sacred purpose. He buried his face in Mrs. Holloway's shoulder and let go of the rigid control he had maintained for so long, allowing himself to be just a boy again, held and protected in the wreckage of the world he had just saved. The survivors watched this scene unfold, their own tears now flowing freely. They were not just tears of relief for their own survival, but tears of a shared catharsis. They were witnessing an act of profound justice. The boy they had ostracized had become their hero. The trauma that had isolated him had become the very thing that bound them all together in a new community, forged in the heart of the storm. The tunnel was not just a shelter made of earth and stone. It was a monument to a son's love for his lost father, and its existence was a testament to the enduring power of memory. In that moment, surrounded by the lives he had rescued, Ezra William Dawson was no longer an orphan. He was the keeper of a sacred promise, the boy who had refused to forget, and in doing so had given them all a future. In the days that followed, the world rushed in to learn the story of the Orphans' Tunnel. Reporters from as far away as Kansas City arrived, their cameras and notepads capturing the astonishing sight of the intact shelter amidst a landscape of complete devastation. Government engineers came, their faces etched with disbelief as they studied the perfect arch of the ceiling, the reinforced walls, the ingenious design of the dual exits. They took measurements and drew diagrams, trying to comprehend how a 12-year-old boy, with nothing but a rusty shovel and a memory, had constructed a shelter more sound and effective than anything they could have designed. His father's lessons, once the private comfort of a grieving son, were now being hailed as a work of intuitive engineering genius, a testament to the practical wisdom of the common man. Ezra did not return to the silent, dusty farmhouse of his great-aunt. His new home was with Beatrice Holloway, who formally adopted him within the month. She told anyone who would listen that the storm had taken her first family, but God had seen fit to give her a son in its place. For Ezra, entering her small, temporary home was like stepping into a different world. It was a place filled not with the silence of neglect, but with the quiet hum of affection and the easy rhythm of a shared life. He was no longer a transaction, a monthly stipend to be tolerated. He was a son. He was family. The simple act of sitting at a table and sharing a meal with her and her children was a miracle more profound than surviving the tornado itself. It was the end of his exile. The event did not just give him a new family, it gave him a new purpose. The fear of the sky never truly left him, but it was no longer a paralyzing terror. It had transformed into a solemn, lifelong mission. He had seen the awesome, indiscriminate power of the wind, but he had also proven that it could be withstood. He devoted the rest of his life to that single, powerful idea. He became a renowned builder, a specialist in the art and science of storm shelters, his design sought after throughout the entire region. He spent the next 5 decades digging into the red Oklahoma earth, not as a traumatized boy fleeing a memory, but as a confident man building a future, ensuring that other families would never have to face the silence he had once known. Over the course of his long life, the shelters designed and built by Ezra Dawson would save the lives of hundreds more people. He became a local legend, a quiet, humble man who carried the weight of his past not as a burden, but as a source of profound strength and empathy. He married, had children and grandchildren of his own, and lived out his days in the town of Moore, a constant, reassuring presence against the unpredictable fury of the sky. He never sought fame or accolades. His satisfaction came from the quiet knowledge that his father's legacy was continuing to grow, protecting generation after generation from the roar of the wind. He died peacefully at the age of 84, on the very same plot of land where he had first begun to dig. The original tunnel, his first and most important creation, was never filled in. It was preserved and maintained by the descendants of the families he had rescued, a permanent monument to the day their world had almost ended. At its entrance, a simple bronze plaque was installed, its words catching the light of the setting sun. It did not speak of engineering or of heroism. It simply read, "Built by Ezra Dawson, age 12, 1905-1906, because he refused to forget."